Hello, podcast fam. I am thrilled to share some exciting news. My book, Sow, Grow, Lead, is officially live on Amazon. This book is more than just my story of starting a nonprofit and building a peanut butter factory in Malawi. So trust me, the ups and downs of that journey are worth the read. It's also packed with practical strategies to help nonprofit leaders like you tackle challenges with clarity, courage, and a whole lot of heart. If you've ever wondered how to turn your vision into reality, navigate the inevitable hurdles, and build something meaningful, whether in your organization or in your own life, this book is for you. I'd be so grateful for your support in spreading the word. Grab your copy of Sow, Grow, Lead in the show notes and on Amazon today. Let's keep sowing seeds of impact together. Are you a nonprofit professional who's feeling overwhelmed and burnt out? Well, welcome to the Lead with Heart podcast. I am your host, Haley Cooper. On this podcast, we will share stories of leadership, courage, and empathy that'll help you learn to take care of yourself, your staff, organization, and community. You will hear from nonprofit leaders who have been in your shoes and have learned best practices to raise more revenue and make a greater impact. Let's thrive together. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Lead with Heart podcast. This is your host, Haley Cooper, and I'm very honored today to have Jake Wood, who is the founder and CEO of Groundswell, a software company that enables companies to make philanthropy an employee benefit by providing tech-enabled donor-advised funds. So, Jake, I'm just so honored to be here with you today, and I just want to say thank you for your service.
Yeah, of course. Well, I appreciate you having me on and I'm excited for the conversation.
I always love to start with this question, a little bit of your background. Obviously, I have it and it'll be in the show notes. But for our listeners, can you tell me a little bit more about your background and what led you to deciding to start Team Rubicon and now becoming a founder and CEO of a completely different company?
I'd say my background's pretty atypical. I went to college after high school and was fortunate enough to be playing sports in college. And so I did that for 4 years, playing football at the University of Wisconsin, and graduated with a degree in business. And I don't think at that time I really wanted to go do the traditional post-business school route. I looked around and decided to join the Marine Corps in 2005. And so I enlisted in the Marine Corps, I joined the infantry. And over the course of 4 years, I ended up serving overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan during the height of both of those wars. And obviously that was a pretty intense, informative experience. At the conclusion of 4 years, decided I was really proud of my service, but didn't want to keep shuttling back and forth between Iraq, Afghanistan, and the States. And so made the really tough choice to get out. And I'll be honest, I didn't really know what I was going to do next. I thought I'd go back to graduate school and get my MBA and maybe take some time to figure it out. But only about 2 months after getting out of the Marines, the Haiti earthquake happened back in 2010. And for those of you that don't remember how horrific that moment was, estimates range pretty broadly, but generally people assume about 150,000 people were killed instantly in that earthquake, and another 100,000 people died in the subsequent months. So you're talking about one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes of the last century. And I sat there watching that event unfold, and having just gotten out of the Marines, having just gotten back from my second tour in Afghanistan, decided that I wanted to help. And so I tried calling a couple of organizations that I knew were on the ground, and none of them were taking random volunteers off the street like me. And so I ended up calling a handful of Marines that I served with and got some doctors together, and we went down to Haiti about 4 days after the earthquake. And really, at that point in time, had no intention of that being anything other than a 1 or 2 week trip to go and help. But you fast forward a decade, and that small team had become a nonprofit organization called Team Rubicon. 10 years into it, we had 150,000 volunteers around the United States and Canada. We'd raised almost $400 million in philanthropy to fuel the work, and we're responding across every corner of the globe and in all 50 states to disasters and humanitarian crises. So definitely an unexpected outcome from what was really just a moment in time decision, but wouldn't change it for the world. It was an amazing journey. And it's really what led me to what I'm doing now. I decided after about a decade of doing that I wanted to be an entrepreneur again. Running Team Rubicon, scaling Team Rubicon was probably the most amazing professional opportunity I'll ever have. But I got to a point where it was just really big, and I had a great executive team that made all the really important decisions. And I was just along for the ride at a certain point and decided I really loved that early stage. And so you promoted my number two to the CEO role. I took over the board as chairman, which those types of transitions are always really tricky for founder-led organizations, but so far so good. And took some time to figure out what was next. And I think, when you're going through those types of transitions, and as an entrepreneur at least, you really take stock of, what am I an expert at? What's the problem that I want to go solve? And so there were a couple things that I think will resonate with your audience of fundraising professionals. One of the things that we'd seen over 10 years running Team Rubicon was the meteoric rise in the utilization of donor-advised funds by high net worth families. And I've always been a big believer that should be democratizing access to these types of things. And so first inspiration was, how do we build a more modern and affordable donor-advised fund that is accessible by the masses so that everybody can give like a millionaire or a billionaire? And that was the first kind of aha moment. And the second one was, as a disaster response executive director, we raised a lot of money from corporate America. And in doing so, we engaged a lot of employee giving programs. And it was always very frustrating for me as a nonprofit executive to, in the aftermath of, say, a hurricane, try to forecast what type of donation revenue we would have for that event, build a plan against it. And then what would invariably happen is that 90 days or 120 days after the disaster hit, we'd get this mountain of paper checks from these legacy corporate giving platforms like Benevity or Cyber Grants. And we would talk about sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions of dollars in checks 120 days later. And I thought, this is restricted funding that I now don't have a plan to spend against. How in the world did it take 4 months for these platforms to get me this money? And that lack of efficiency, or the presence of that inefficiency, is what really inspired us to take that idea of using a donor-advised fund, making it an employee benefit, and building really a better way for companies to engage their employees. So that's a really long-winded answer to your question, but that's the story of how I got to where I am today.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Jake. And yeah, there's a lot to unpack in there. But again, just thank you for your service in the Marine Corps and really utilizing what you saw to then build up an organization to respond to disasters and engaging other veterans or into the organization to become part of that disaster response. And you mentioned something about being a founder and building out a team under you that was really doing the day-to-day. So I think a lot of nonprofits struggle with this, where there is, for lack of a better term, founder syndrome, where people are the founder, they're the CEO. And I think nowadays, especially after the pandemic, a lot of those founders are realizing, oh, well, we want to live a second life, or we want to retire, and for whatever reason. And I think a lot of people still hold on tight to that vision. And it's really hard to delegate to other people because it's your baby. You started it. You have this idea in your head of where you want this to go. So I would love to ask you, the first part of this kind of transition and change management focus is, how did you shift within yourself first to like really come to terms that, oh, I can hire other people to run this? And then how did you begin to delegate responsibility and step away?
Yeah, I think I realized very early on that I was in over my head. I had never run anything in my life. I didn't even know what a 501c3 was before we were incorporated. And so if I had tried to fake all of those things, we never would have gotten off the ground. So from the very beginning, I had to acknowledge where my gaps were in running an organization of any size, let alone organization with a $50 million budget. And so I think very early, maybe I was lucky, I don't know. I was ready to acknowledge that I didn't have all the answers. And so I had some early practice at delegating some of those elements. Now, I think what's really important for founders to understand is, what are the things that nobody else can do? right? There are certain things that only a founder can do. And then as a result, only a founder should do those things up until some scale. And that's evangelizing, that is raising the funds, that is setting the tone and the culture and the vision and all of those elements. And maybe you're a founder that can do those things and you're also an excellent operator. At a certain point in time, though, you got to determine or realize that there are other operators that you can bring in to run the business because only you as the founder can focus on those other elements. So I think that was one of the things that I tried to really focus my time and energy on is what are the activities that only I can undertake or that only I can perform at the highest level. And it was those things for us. It was the fundraising, it was the strategy, it was the culture. But eventually those things, you have to start ceding control of them. And I think one of the things that we really tried to determine early or establish early was that this wasn't my show. I was the founder because I was there at the beginning, but what we really focused on was trying to build a movement that far surpassed any single person or initial group of people, co-founders. And it was hard because I think I was such a visible face of Team Rubicon. Team Rubicon was a very high-profile organization. I did a lot of media appearances, a lot of public speaking. I think for a lot of people, they saw me as synonymous with the organization. But behind the scenes, we were very deliberately trying to ensure that it was way more than me as a force of personality, and that it was really ownership of what we were trying to accomplish was held by all of our staff, all of our volunteers, all of our stakeholders. And I think that effort paid off. I was also very clear from the beginning that I wasn't going to be running it forever. And it wasn't because I didn't want to. It was because I think it's just important for organizations to evolve. My staff probably laughs because I used to say this phrase all the time. If, organizations are no different than any living organism. If they're not constantly evolving, then they're just slowly dying. Mm-hmm. And so I think organizations are every bit a living organism. And so part of that evolution is a change in people. And that's not necessarily bad. And so I was forecasting for 10 years and I stayed there for 11 years, but for 10 or 11 years, hey, there's going to be a transition at the top. And frankly, I thought it was going to happen earlier than it did. But I just kept having fun. I kept growing. I kept every year seeing myself rise to the challenge. But at a certain point in time, I realized that it was time for the organization to bring in fresh leadership.
Imagine a fundraising partner that not only helps you raise more money, but also supports you in retaining your donors. A partner that helps you raise funds both online and on location so you can grow your impact faster. That's DonorBox, a comprehensive suite of tools, services, and resources that give fundraisers just like you a custom solution to tackle your unique challenges, helping you achieve the growth and sustainability your organization needs, helping you help others. Visit donorbox.org to learn more. Wow, that's amazing. And I think that level of humility that you had is really admirable, that you knew from the beginning that you didn't know all the answers. And I think that is a mark of a good leader, is knowing that you don't have to know all the answers, having that humility to then bring people in to fill in where you may lack, to fill in and build that strong team. And I know that Team Rubicon has a strong corporate culture. They've been nominated like best workplace of the year multiple years in a row. So how did you, and you mentioned this when you were just talking, but like, how do you instill a strong corporate culture from the beginning and then have it maintain those waves of transition?
Yeah, I remember early as we were hitting some of our various stages of, call it hyper scaling, which would happen, every 18 months or so for the first 5 or 6 years at TR. I remember a couple of those early phases having people ask the question, hey, is the victim of this growth going to be our culture? Can our culture scale as the rest of the organization's operations scale? And I tried to reframe that question for people that would ask it. And I would say the only way that we scale is because of our culture. Like our culture won't be the victim of it. It'll be the catalyst for it. And if you get people to believe that, then it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And a lot of it's just the mental aspect of that manifesting itself. But we did focus a lot on culture, I think, because a lot of us had a shared background in the military. A lot of that culture came from our shared military experience. And I think the military is broadly understood to have a strong culture. Strong doesn't necessarily always mean good, but it's a very strong culture. It's a well-defined culture. There are elements of it that are really bad. I think we were willing to acknowledge that. And so we tried to pull and extract the elements from the military that we saw as really positive and leave a lot of the bad stuff behind. And so we focused a lot on commitment to mission, commitment to esprit de corps, commitment to shared values, and things like a bias for action, and a lot of those elements. I think from there, one of the things that's really important that a lot of leaders don't get right is it's incumbent upon a CEO not just to define the values of an organization to the culmination of your culture, but to then ensure that every element of how you operate reinforces those values. And I think that there's usually a disconnect that can be found there. You'll have someone who says one thing as a value, but then there are elements of how they run the business, whether it's a policy or a process or how they pay people, that are in contradiction to that value. And it's really easy because a lot of those business elements, those are the things that get outsourced. Those are the things that you delegate. And so if an executive is not closely keeping their finger on the pulse of those elements and identifying those contradictory processes or practices, then your culture just falls apart because it's not mutually reinforcing. And so that was one of the things that as an executive team, we spent a lot of time doing, was trying to identify those contradictions. Our values were ironclad. Everybody knew them. It was our job to ensure that they were reflected in everything that we did and how we ran the business.
Yes, I love that. And I think I've seen in a lot of nonprofits, like you said about those contradictions, like they have a mission, they have values, and they're living it out externally, but they forget to then turn it around and live it in internally and take care of their people, make sure that the corporate culture is strong internally, because like you said, like your organization was able to scale because that was the catalyst for it and was able to support that along the way. And so it's crucial to really prioritize that corporate culture internally so that you can have that operational scale. And do you have any specific strategies that have proven effective in your strong organizational culture that not only attracts and retains your employees at that executive level? What were some of those strategies that you talked about to maintain that strong company culture throughout that scaling?
I think one comes to mind, and I'll try to frame this up for you. So the way that we or I define culture at Team Rubicon, and I continue to think of it through this lens, is culture is what guides people's decisions in the absence of orders, right? Mm-hmm. So when people don't know explicitly what to do, your culture is what's going to guide them to a consistent decision, behavior, or attitude. And if it's a good culture, then they're going to consistently end up in the right place, right? Not every time, it's not perfect, but consistently. And so one of the things that we were pretty good at Team Rubicon was not being a policy-driven culture. Because what's a policy? A policy is it's an explicit if this, then that, right? It's an explicit order on what to do when you encounter any specific situation. So companies or organizations that are very policy-driven are either highly regulated, right? And in which case you can't get around it, or they have really weak cultures because they don't trust their culture, which is amorphous. It's not necessarily written down on paper, right? It's shared across the consciousness of your people. You don't trust that to guide people to the right decision. And so every time somebody screws up, you create a policy so that it doesn't happen again. And one of the things I think was really good at Team Rubicon is it was really hard to pass a policy. If somebody came to the executive team with a recommendation for a policy that wasn't driven by some state or federal regulation, you were going to have a hard time getting people to agree. And so I can tell you the strength or weakness of any particular culture by how easy it is to pass a policy.
Interesting. I've never heard that perspective before, but I like that, when having it not necessarily just be policy driven and really just focusing down on that culture. And for individuals considering starting their own nonprofit, I think I already asked this question, but if you have any other steps that can be taken from the outset to establish a positive, inclusive culture that really resonates with those mission and goals?
Well, I think when you're starting from scratch, first, I would challenge how sane you are if you wake up one day and say, hey, I want to make a living trying to start a nonprofit from scratch. You should probably talk to some nonprofit founders first, but let's assume that you take that leap. I think one of the important things that's important to understand is with a nonprofit, nobody has ownership, right? There's no equity that anybody has. There's no shared, and I say no in quotation marks, right? Because obviously everybody's sharing in the success and the outcomes that are being delivered through the mission itself. But what you can give them is shared ownership of the culture. And people actually really value that because I think most people, whether they want to admit it or not, they want to be a part of a strong, powerful culture, a tribe, a community of like-minded people. And if you give them ownership of shaping that, then they'll ruthlessly protect it. And that's how it scales.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I had someone else on the podcast, Tucker Wanamaker from Thrive Impact, and we were talking about how you have to get that buy-in and belonging before you get to the strategy, before you get to the work. You have to make sure that people understand how important they are to the mission, that their role is valuable, that they're contributing towards that scaling, and continuing to have that vision in front of them and making sure that they feel a part of the team, not just a part of that policy or the sub outcome, a working person. They're actually a shared part of that mission. And I think that's such an important point that you made.
Yeah.
So I want to transition because I'm a fundraiser and I'm sure people on this podcast want to know how you scaled your organization to raise over $400 million. So I got to ask some fundraising questions. So could you elaborate on any key strategies or tactics that you were able to you scaled so quickly? So what were some of those key strategies and tactics that you were able to invite people into your mission?
I don't think any of it was very cosmic. And we certainly made some strategic errors. I didn't hire my first professional fundraiser until 5 years in, which means that we were just raising money for those first 5 or 6 years through brute force and luck. What we did focus on was building a powerful brand and storytelling machine. Now, we were lucky, if that's the right word, in that responding to natural disasters, using military veterans, there's some sensational elements to that story that make for powerful storytelling, but we still focused on it. So what's that mean? We had a well-defined brand and voice. That voice cut against the grain. We weren't afraid to stand out with our voice in the space. We invested in really great photography and videography. Today, everybody does that, and great videos and photos are ubiquitous because of things like the iPhone, but this was before that was really a thing. We still invested in that because we really wanted people to have that emotional connection with what the work was that we were doing. And so our philosophy early was, we're going to put our nose to the grindstone and we're going to do best in class work. And then we're going to tell a great story and the money's going to come. I'm not so sure it was the best strategy in the world, right? It probably would have helped to have some professional fundraisers who knew what the hell that they were doing along the way. But I think, again, just through sheer force of will and some luck, we were able to get to a point where by 2015, 5 years in, we were raising $5 million a year, which is a lot of money. Today, we're raising $50 million a year. But 5 years in, we got there and we hired a professional fundraising leader, built out a small team around it. And that was, I think, where we started to see then a lot of growth. And the other thing that I would say, though, is we weren't afraid to bet on ourselves. There were moments that were highly consequential decision points where we had to make a decision, whether we put all of our chips on the table and take a bet on ourselves or play more conservatively. And it's not to say that we were cavalier in approaching those moments, but we were highly confident in our own capabilities. And when those moments came, people talk about luck being when opportunity meets preparation. I've spoken a lot about getting lucky over the last 5 minutes, but if you think about luck through that lens, these opportunities are presented almost universally to folks in that entrepreneurial journey. It's how well are you prepared for that moment? And then how willing are you to bet on yourself in that moment? And we always found ourselves pretty prepared and we were more than willing to bet on ourselves. And it didn't always work out, but on the balance, it worked out way more frequently than it didn't.
Yeah, and I think that's so important because I think a lot of nonprofits operate from that scarcity mindset where they're scared to take risks on themselves. They're scared to step up and have that strong brand voice. And so I think this is an important story for people that are listening to this. Failure isn't necessarily bad. Failure can be a learning opportunity. And sometimes you have to take those risks and fall down to get back up and learn and continue charting the path forward. And I would love to know, I've had other guests on this podcast talk about branding and storytelling. And I think it's such an important piece of nonprofits that a lot of people miss out on. They don't have that strong brand voice. They don't have that strong storytelling. And I think part of the storytelling comes again from serving really vulnerable people and trying to tread what is that ethical boundary of being able to video people or have those photographs or tell their stories. And so what kind of, for lack of a better term, policies or ideas does Team Rubicon have around telling those stories of the people that you are impacting?
Yeah, certainly. You never want to rob anyone of their dignity in those moments. And we work with highly vulnerable populations who have just experienced the worst day of their life following a disaster, whether it was a hurricane, a wildfire, an earthquake, whatever it is, or a civil war. We respond on the ground in places like South Sudan and Ukraine, so direct conflict zones. And it's always a challenge. And you have to decide whether or not you're going to take the Sarah McLachlan pleasing puppy dog approach, or if you're going to do something that's more uplifting. We did a couple of things so that we didn't fall on the wrong side of that line. One, we focused a lot on the stories of the people that we were sending. And so these inspiring stories of mostly American citizens willing to raise their hand and continue to serve their country and their community in really compelling ways, to drop everything, take 10 days of paid time off from their full-time job, to fly halfway across the country to go help people they've never met in a community that they've never been to. So there was this inspiring narrative that we had on one side of our mission, which was this engagement of these military veterans. And one of the interesting components of that, there were a lot of organizations over the last 2 decades that have raised a lot of money in the veteran space on this broken veteran narrative. Again, the freezing puppy dog version of this, but in the veteran space. And we never wanted to be that. We never wanted to exploit veterans who were wounded, who were suffering in a way that robbed them or their broader veteran community of that dignity. Rather, we wanted to drive a compelling story of veterans as having, gained these skills and experiences through their service that they could continue to repurpose to serve their country. And that was inspiring. We probably could have raised a lot more money if we'd played a broken veteran narrative. We definitely left money on the table by not doing it. But we weren't ever going to compromise what we saw as our values to chase that. Then on serving the survivors of these disasters, yeah, it's challenging. You never want to exploit anyone. You want to make sure that you have their permission to use their likeness in any way. And I think for us, it was really about building relationships. And so when we're in a rural Alabama responding to a tornado, it's not even pulling a camera out until you've been helping that same homeowner for 3 days, and then they know how authentic your desire to help them is. And that story becomes less one of victimhood and one more of someone who's been empowered to live on, right, in a newfound way. But it's not easy.
Yeah, and I love that you really stuck to your values and that idea of this is how we want to portray our organization, not only internally, but externally, and really sticking to those values. Even if money was left on the table, I think it speaks volumes to portray military veterans as this inspirational. And you don't have to do the broken people. People sometimes want those stories, but it is about that inspiration. It is about that hope, an aspiring hope, and what can come next. And I think that's such an important distinction. And I think people are moving away from those, they call it poverty porn, like the sad kids from UNICEF. People are moving away from that because it's not necessarily ethical. It's not telling the whole story. It's just telling one piece, and you don't understand all the context of that one photo.
Right.
So you talked a lot, or I want to shift a little bit to Groundswell and where it is at today. So how can nonprofits collaborate with donor advised funds? First of all, what is a donor advised fund for people who are listening and don't necessarily know what a DAF is? And then what does that look like on the corporate side as well as the nonprofit side? Like, what is that bridge?
Yeah, so a donor advised fund or a DAF is a tax advantaged charitable giving vehicle, kind of purpose built for philanthropy. So you can think of it like the lightweight version of a personal foundation without any of the legal or governance requirements. So these things have been around for decades. They've just exploded in utilization over the last 15 years among high net worth families in the United States. And we're talking about accounts that are offered by wealth management firms like Morgan Stanley, where in order to open one, you have to be willing to contribute $20,000 to that account, which is why they're used by high net worth families, because the average donor out there can't contribute anywhere close to $20,000 in a single moment, let alone even across their lifetime to open up a donor advised fund. But they have tons of tax advantages. And I just came to the realization that there was no reason why you needed to have those types of minimums with today's technological infrastructure supporting financial companies like ours. And so we built a modern donor advised fund. It's a native mobile app. Think of it like a Venmo account for charitable giving. And it's got all of the same tax advantages of a traditional DAF. So what we saw was this opportunity then to build a platform that supported this at a corporate level, where companies could then automate their giving and matching programs through these. A lot of Fortune 500 companies offer things like donation matching up to some annual limit. They'll run these disaster-related campaigns driven by events that are happening in the world. But again, they're either doing these things manually, or the platforms that they're using to support them are just legacy tech and they're not very user-friendly. So we built a platform that automates things like donation matching programs. So now you can think of what we've built as like a 401k, employer-sponsored, tax-advantaged, offering a match if the employer chooses up to some limit, a 401k for philanthropy.
Wow, I love that. And I think sometimes people, and I had, again, someone else on the podcast talk about like how everyone can be a philanthropist. It doesn't have to be just high net worth individuals. There are so many ways that you can be a philanthropist. And I think providing that opportunity for people to realize their giving and their generosity and their legacy at minimal levels, like just speaks volumes, because people want to give back. They want to, but sometimes it's not accessible. And then they're like, well, how can I make an impact if I can't give $20,000, but just $100 can make a huge impact? And so do you pair the employees with the nonprofits, or do they do that themselves? Like, how does that gap bridge?
Yeah, the way the platform works today, we ingest all the IRS nonprofits into our database. And so any nonprofit that's out there that's in good standing with the IRS is available on the platform. We do have some discovery tools that we've built, so users can explore nonprofits by certain issue areas and categories. We have featured spotlights that are event driven. So it might be Black History Month, and we'll highlight 12 great racial justice organizations, or it might be Veterans Day, and we'll highlight some great veterans focused nonprofits, et cetera. We see a huge opportunity there down the road as we scale to build a much smarter recommendation tool. I think a lot of people want to give back. I think that they're intimidated, though, by philanthropy. I think with kind of the rise in things around machine learning and artificial intelligence, there's a real opportunity to help people make smarter decisions, just to lower that barrier to entry, lower that threshold of understanding, so that people can type a couple of prompts and find hyperlocal organizations or global organizations focused on very specific and niche issues that they're interested in. We have to earn the right to get there, which means we need, 50,000 more users on the platform, whatever the number is. But we will get there, and we'll be really excited to build stuff like that.
But you can use AI. One of our local organization that I give to was telling me that a foundation across the country, I'm in Orange County, so it was somewhere on the East Coast, did AI to search for organizations specifically in their service area and was able to identify them, then do the research. And so they used some sort of AI tool, I don't know which one, to identify this organization that was completely out of their geographic area.
Yeah.
But they gave to them because through AI, they were able to find them, which I thought was so cool.
We're already exploring use cases like that. So it's really exciting. The next couple of years are going to be pretty transformative.
Yeah, and hopefully more philanthropic dollars will be going back into the sector.
Let's hope.
Well, Jake, do you have anything else you would like to share about leadership or fundraising, or just your experience in the nonprofits?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground today. I really valued the opportunity to come in, and hopefully there are at least a couple of takeaways in there for some of your listeners.
Yes, I think so. And where can people find you?
I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn. Look for Jake Wood. You can search Groundswell. You can find out more about groundswell.io. And then Team Rubicon, also pretty easy to find. TeamRubiconUSA.org is that website, and pretty active across social media as well. Team Rubicon is.
Well, thank you so much, Jake, for having this conversation with me. I really enjoyed learning from you.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Haley.
If you have valued these stories or learned something from what you've heard, please share this podcast episode or follow me on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for your support, and together we can build a better community and world.